In the early years of the air war over Europe, pilots had a very clear idea of what a fighter was supposed to be. It had to be fast, it had to turn tightly, and above all, it had to feel right in a dogfight. Anything that failed those expectations earned distrust quickly. So when this aircraft arrived, many pilots dismissed it almost immediately. It was too big, too heavy, too sluggish in a turn. It climbed slower than its rivals and didn't behave the way fighter pilots expected a fighter to behave. Some joked that it flew like a truck. Others quietly wondered why they were being asked to risk their lives in something that felt fundamentally wrong for air combat. Compared to sleek enemy fighters, it looked oversized and awkward. In mock engagements, it struggled to outturn opponents. In training, it didn't inspire confidence. And among pilots who had grown up believing that agility won fights, this aircraft seemed to offer none of it. To many, it wasn't dangerous. It was useless. But while pilots argued about maneuverability, the war was killing aircrews somewhere else entirely. Bombers were being shredded long before they reached their targets. Escort fighters ran out of fuel. Pilots who survived one mission often didn't survive the next. Losses weren't just tactical. They were cumulative. Experience was being erased faster than it could be replaced. The deadliest problem in the air war wasn't losing dogfights. It was not coming home. And that problem didn't care how well an aircraft turned. It cared how much punishment it could absorb, how far it could fly, how quickly it could disengage, and whether a pilot could still be alive when the mission ended. This aircraft was never designed to impress in a turning circle. Its designers had made trade-offs that looked strange on paper and worse in the cockpit. They had sacrificed elegance for endurance, agility for protection, comfort for survival. At first, those choices looked like mistakes. Then combat began to reveal something else. Pilots started returning with aircraft that should not have made it back at all. Wings torn, fuselages ripped open, engines damaged, yet still flying. They survived hits that would have destroyed lighter fighters outright. They dove away from danger when others couldn't. They landed aircraft riddled with holes and walked away. Quietly, without ceremony, the aircraft began solving a problem no one had been able to fix. It wasn't winning fights the way pilots expected. It was keeping pilots alive. And in a war where experience mattered more than any single victory, that changed everything. What had been mocked as oversized and useless wasn't wrong. It was simply answering a different question. This is the story of the fighter that didn't look right, didn't feel right, and wasn't loved at first, but ended up solving the deadliest problem in the air war by refusing to play by the rules everyone else believed in. To understand why this aircraft was mocked, you have to understand what fighter pilots believed before the war truly began. Air combat doctrine in the late 1930s was still shaped by older assumptions. Fighters were expected to win by turning tighter, climbing faster, and outmaneuvering the enemy at close range. Speed mattered, but agility mattered more. Pilots were trained to think of air combat as a contest of finesse, a test of skill where the better flyer, in the better handling aircraft, would prevail. That mindset shaped expectations. And those expectations shaped judgment. The aircraft that would later be known as the P-47 Thunderbolt was never designed to fit comfortably into that tradition. From the beginning, its designers were solving a different problem. They weren't trying to build the lightest or most agile fighter. They were trying to build one that could survive modern air combat at high altitude, over long distances, against heavily armed opponents. That decision had consequences. The P-47 was built around a massive radial engine, one of the largest ever installed in a single-engine fighter. That engine required a large airframe. The airframe required strength. Strength meant weight, and weight meant the aircraft would never turn like the lighter fighters pilots were used to. On paper, the numbers didn't impress pilots looking for agility. In the cockpit, the aircraft felt heavy. Control inputs were slower to respond. In mock dogfights, it struggled to match opponents that could pivot tightly and climb more aggressively at lower altitudes. For pilots trained to equate maneuverability with survival, these characteristics felt like warnings. But the designers weren't chasing elegance. They were chasing endurance. The war they anticipated was not one of short-range interception. It was a war of long missions, high altitudes, and sustained exposure to enemy fire. Bombers would fly deep into hostile territory. Escorts would have to follow them all the way there, and all the way back. And when things went wrong, there would be no friendly airfields below. To meet those demands, the aircraft was built with heavy armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and a structure designed to absorb punishment. Its engine could keep running even when damaged. Its dive speed allowed it to disengage when necessary. Its fuel capacity allowed it to stay with bombers longer than many early fighters could manage. None of that impressed pilots during training. Those advantages didn't show up in a turning circle or a climb rate chart. They only appeared when aircraft were hit, when fuel ran low, and when pilots needed to get home through hostile skies. Early in the war, doctrine hadn't caught up with reality yet. Pilots were still being asked to fight the war they had imagined, not the one they were actually flying. And against that expectation, the P-47 felt wrong. It was heavier than it should have been, larger than it needed to be, slower to respond than pilots wanted. But what looked like flaws were actually deliberate choices. The aircraft wasn't built to win quick, elegant fights. It was built to survive long, brutal ones. And the war was about to prove how important that difference really was. The moment that changed how the aircraft was judged did not arrive as a revelation. There was no announcement, no single mission everyone pointed to, no dramatic reversal of opinion overnight. Instead, the change came quietly, through patterns that only became visible over time. Pilots began coming back. At first, no one thought much of it. Aircraft returned damaged all the time. But as missions continued, something unusual started to stand out. Pilots flying this aircraft were surviving hits that routinely destroyed lighter fighters. Engines took damage and kept running. Control surfaces were torn but remained functional. Fuel tanks were punctured and sealed themselves. Aircraft landed riddled with holes that should have made survival impossible. What mattered wasn't how the aircraft fought at the beginning of an engagement. It was how it behaved at the end. The air war over Europe was not a series of clean, isolated dogfights. It was a grinding contest of attrition. Bombers flew deep into hostile airspace, exposed for hours. Escorts were attacked repeatedly, often outnumbered, often far from friendly territory. Pilots didn't just have to win fights, they had to survive them, again and again, mission after mission. This is where the aircraft's design began to make sense. When enemy fighters attacked bomber formations, escort pilots often had to choose between pressing an engagement or staying close to protect the bombers. Chasing kills could pull them out of position. Turning tightly could bleed speed and energy. And once speed was lost at altitude, recovery was not guaranteed. The aircraft's pilots learned a different way to fight. Instead of turning battles into contests of agility, they used altitude, speed, and dive performance. They attacked with energy, disengaged when necessary, and returned to formation. They avoided prolonged turning fights where the aircraft was weakest, and exploited the areas where it was strongest. More importantly, when they were hit, they often lived. The massive radial engine at the front of the aircraft absorbed damage that would have destroyed inline engines. Heavy armor protected pilots from fragments and gunfire. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced the risk of catastrophic fires. The aircraft's structure could take punishment and remain controllable long enough to get home. These advantages didn't make pilots fearless. They made them confident that survival was possible. As losses mounted elsewhere, units flying this aircraft began to retain experienced pilots. That mattered more than any single performance metric. Air combat was a learned skill. Pilots who survived 10 missions were better than pilots on their first. Pilots who survived 20 were exponentially more effective. Experience compounded, and survivability allowed experience to accumulate. Slowly, the perception began to shift. Commanders noticed that some units were losing fewer pilots. Maintenance crews noticed how much damage these aircraft could absorb and still return. Intelligence reports began to show consistent escort coverage deeper into enemy territory. Bombers that once flew unprotected over the most dangerous stretches now had fighters with them longer. None of this made the aircraft beloved. Pilots still complained about its weight and handling. It was still outturned by enemy fighters. It was still unforgiving if flown carelessly. But it was no longer dismissed. Requests for the aircraft increased. Missions were planned with its strengths in mind. Tactics evolved to fit what it could do, rather than forcing it into roles it was never designed for. The aircraft stopped being judged by how it felt in training, and started being judged by what it accomplished in combat. Perhaps the most important change was philosophical. Pilots and planners alike began to accept that air combat was not about winning every engagement. It was about surviving enough of them to matter. An aircraft that could keep pilots alive, keep bombers protected, and keep pressure on the enemy over time was more valuable than one that excelled only under ideal conditions. The aircraft hadn't changed. The understanding of the war had. By the time this realization fully set in, the ridicule had faded. The jokes stopped. The aircraft was no longer seen as a mistake that needed to be tolerated until something better arrived. It was seen as a tool, imperfect, specialized, and essential. It didn't win fights by looking impressive. It won by being there at the end of the mission. And in a war where survival was the difference between learning and being replaced, that quietly made it one of the most important fighters in the sky. Once the aircraft's role was understood, its impact became measurable. Not in dramatic moments, but in steady change. Escort missions began lasting longer. Bomber formations that once lost protection deep inside enemy territory were now accompanied farther and more consistently. Pilots returned from missions they would not have survived earlier in the war. Loss rates did not disappear, but they slowed. And in an air war defined by attrition, slowing losses mattered. The most important effect was not what the aircraft destroyed, but what it preserved. Experienced pilots stayed alive. That experience accumulated inside squadrons instead of being reset by casualties. Veterans trained new arrivals. Tactics improved. Decision-making sharpened. Units became more disciplined, more coordinated, and more effective over time. This kind of growth could only happen if pilots survived long enough for it to matter. The aircraft also changed how missions were planned. Commanders stopped expecting every fighter to excel in every role. Instead, they began assigning aircraft based on what they did best. This aircraft was used where endurance, toughness, and reliability mattered most. It became a shield rather than a duelist, a presence meant to deny the enemy easy victories rather than chase dramatic ones. On the ground, maintenance crews adapted quickly. They learned how much punishment the airframe could take and still be repaired. Aircraft that would have been written off earlier in the war were returned to service. This reduced strain on production and logistics, another quiet advantage that compounded over time. The aircraft's durability also opened new possibilities. As the war progressed, it proved exceptionally effective in ground attack roles. Its ability to absorb damage allowed it to operate at low altitude against heavily defended targets. Pilots who trusted the aircraft to bring them home were willing to fly missions others might have avoided. That trust was earned through experience, not reputation. Importantly, the aircraft never replaced everything else. It worked alongside other fighters, each filling different roles as doctrine matured. Air superiority was not achieved by one perfect machine, but by a system of aircraft, tactics, and logistics that complemented one another. This aircraft's contribution was survivability, a quality that rarely receives attention, but underpins every sustained campaign. By the later stages of the war, the earlier mockery seemed almost irrelevant. The aircraft was no longer judged by how it compared in a turning fight, or how it felt to a pilot used to lighter controls. It was judged by outcomes. Missions completed, pilots returned, pressure maintained on the enemy. The war did not change because this aircraft appeared. It changed because the Allies learned how to use it properly. And once they did, the aircraft stopped being a compromise and became an asset. One that allowed air power to be applied continuously, relentlessly, and with fewer irreversible losses. That was its real impact. Not dominance, not elegance, but endurance. When the war ended, the arguments about this aircraft faded quickly. The conditions that had shaped its reputation, constant combat, pilot loss, and doctrinal uncertainty, disappeared almost overnight. What remained was perspective. In hindsight, the aircraft was never meant to be loved. It was meant to endure. Post-war analysis made that clear. Records showed how often these aircraft returned damaged but intact. How frequently pilots survived engagements that would have been fatal in lighter fighters. How experience accumulated inside units that flew them. What once felt like compromises were reclassified as strengths. The lesson was uncomfortable, but undeniable. Air combat was not decided by what felt best in training or looked best on paper. It was decided by what kept working after the first hit, the second mission, and the 10th close call. Survivability was not a secondary feature. It was a strategic advantage. That realization shaped future aircraft design. Engineers no longer chased performance alone. Protection, redundancy, and pilot survival became integral parts of the equation. The idea that a fighter could trade elegance for endurance and still be effective became accepted rather than resisted. The aircraft's legacy also reshaped how success was remembered. It did not become famous for a single battle or ace. It did not dominate headlines. Its impact was cumulative, quiet, and statistical. It showed up in squadrons that retained experience, in missions completed with fewer losses, and in pilots who lived long enough to pass on what they had learned. In a sense, the early mockery was understandable. People judge systems by how they behave under familiar conditions. The aircraft only revealed its value under extreme ones. And war is nothing if not extreme. Today, the aircraft is remembered with respect rather than ridicule. Not because it was perfect, but because it was honest about what it was designed to do. It accepted its limitations and focused on what mattered most when lives were on the line. The irony is that the aircraft never changed. Only the understanding of the war did. Once survival became the priority instead of elegance, the so-called useless fighter no longer looked wrong. It looked necessary. That is its legacy. A reminder that in complex systems, especially in war, success does not belong to what impresses first, but to what endures when everything else begins to fail.